the Anarcho-Christian podcast, evaluating the relationship between the Christian and the state.
Give us a king to rule us when you're gone. His life's work had been to help the people understand it's not the role of a man to rule over other men.
Hi everybody, welcome back to the show. Today I'd like to take a little time to reflect on the United States Pledge of Allegiance. I thought about the few different ways that I could present this topic and the things that can be said on it, but the way that I decided to go with for this episode is just to lay out all of the information with as little opinion and editorializing from me as possible. I want everyone listening to make your own decisions, but maybe I'll ask some questions along the way to get our minds thinking on something that we may tend to accept without much thought. The whole pledge topic seems fairly straightforward, but as I reflect on the conversations that I've had on it, it actually gets pretty emotional. But this is understandable, since it's something that we've had baked into our identity as Americans since birth, and for as many generations as we have alive today. It's very important for us to remember that everyone that is alive today to discuss the meaning or ideas of the Pledge of Allegiance has had the pledge worked into their memory for as far back as they can remember. To put it another way, I don't think there is anyone alive today that remembers a time before the Pledge of Allegiance. Anything can become very passionate in this sense. Like I mentioned, things that are with us from the earliest times of our lives, from the time that we start education, from the time that we start speaking and memorizing, the Pledge of Allegiance has been there. And it was there in the same way for your parents, and their parents, and their parents, and depending on how old you are, maybe even their parents. So, all that to say, I've chosen this way of simply presenting information because, one, I think the facts speak for themselves, and two, because these sorts of emotional responses that come from the generations of conditioning from very early ages can devolve quickly into emotional responses. Podcasts are a newer form of radio program. I'd hate for it to turn into some AM or political show yelling into your eardrum, causing a lot of emotional response without much education. I'm sure you know the type of show that I'm talking about, and I think they are partially to blame for the current inability of people to have a rational discussion on politics. So with all that said, I will not be doing an emotional rant or pushing my opinions on the subject. Like I said earlier, I think the facts speak for themselves, and I want you to make your own decisions based on those facts. Maybe you and I will come to the same conclusion. Maybe we will part ways. But whatever we do, it will be because of the acceptance or rejection of the facts, not because we are fighting over the way the facts make us feel. Okay, so where to start? Even though we are just stating facts about the Pledge of Allegiance, I want to also tackle rhetoric. Rather than just read off Wikipedia facts, I want to address not only what is historical of the matter, but also all the little rhetorical things that get brought up when discussing the merits of the Pledge of Allegiance. So this is why I'm going to ask a lot of questions along the way. Maybe it'll give away where I'm coming from. But again, my intention is just to get us thinking. Maybe the answers to those questions are different between you and I. But to do all this, I think we need to break this conversation down into a couple of different categories. And I see three distinct categories when we are questioning and discussing the Pledge of Allegiance: what it isn't, what it is, and where it came from. So let's just get started. What it isn't. It may seem odd to not begin with where it came from, but in my experience working through this information for myself for the first time and then discussing it in multiple different settings, there are quite a few myths and assumptions that are better to get out of the way first. Let's not forget that this, whether we realize it or not, is on par with any other topic with sacred significance. So let me throw out a couple of things that may or may not resonate with you, and the additional detail will likely be found in our other two categories of what it is and where it came from. So to start it all off, the Pledge of Allegiance was not written or performed during the time of the American Revolution or the founding of the United States. It was not written by any founders. It is not found in the Declaration of Independence nor the Constitution. I'm not sure how many other ways I can put it, but I think it is important to bring this up. We are presented with the pledge from a very early age to accompany all of our learning of American history and citizenship. But we are not presented with its history. So the assumption that I believe that leaves behind is that it was always there. It's very similar to the slogan, "In God We Trust." It's just always been there, right? But that is another subject for another show. Anyways, it was not written by Thomas Jefferson or Benjamin Franklin, and it wasn't recited by George Washington nor the Continental Army. It also isn't, quote, "no big deal," end quote. This is something I see as an objection to objections over the pledge. And at the risk of editorializing, let me just say that anything that elicits the type of argument the pledge does and is considered a requirement for various school and civic responsibilities definitely is a big deal. This should actually be something that both sides of the pledge debate should agree on, that it's a big deal. The Pledge of Allegiance isn't found in the Bible either. I know that sounds absurd, right? The thing is, I've seen many different Bibles that include it. Again, at the risk of editorializing, think about what that means. Even if you love the Pledge of Allegiance and what good and noble qualities you might think it can bring to communities and individuals, why put it in the Bible? What does that do with the position of the Pledge of Allegiance in comparison with Scripture? We are told and typically affirm that Scripture is God-breathed. What do you think we are implying when we bind the pledge together with God's Word? I realize I've given a lot of questions. I think just asking those questions lets you know where I'm coming from with all that. And I don't think I need to elaborate any further of what I think all of this specifically implies. But if it still doesn't resonate, let me ask you to imagine a few other Bibles that may or may not have been bound throughout history. And think for yourself, what would this mean? How about an English Bible with the Oath of Allegiance to the Queen? How about a 1940s German Bible with a Pledge of Allegiance to the Reich? How about two different Bibles printed in the 1860s, one with a pledge to the Union and one with a pledge to the Confederacy? What about the Apostles' Epistles, starting or ending with a pledge to Rome? What about a Russian Bible printed before the Bolsheviks that includes a pledge to the Tsar? This is why I think it's important to say up front the pledge is not found in the Bible. If you cringed at any of those ideas, and if you hadn't already been brought up with the pledge for your whole life, would you not find the idea of it bound in a Bible today to be equally cringeworthy? Okay, now let's get to what it is. We've heard it a million times. We can recite it even if we hadn't said it in years.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, that's what it says, or what we say, but what is the pledge? One thing I see thrown at objectors to the pledge is that it isn't a pledge to the government. This is usually associated with an additional defense that it represents an allegiance to your fellow countrymen and ideals of freedom and such. The thing is, it is exactly a pledge to the government. As I already mentioned, we memorize the pledge from a very early age. When we do that, we tend to not pay attention to a lot of the meaning. This sort of conditioning leads to us putting our own projections onto the words, rather than paying attention to what we're actually saying. Let's just look at it simply. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America. This is where we project our images of the homeland, freedom, and countrymen, right? But let's look at the very next line. And to the republic for which it stands. There, right there, is your pledge to the government. Most of us would agree that Merriam-Webster's dictionary will give us an accurate definition, and it defines a republic as a government having a chief of state who is not a monarch and who, in modern times, is usually a president. And a political unit, such as a nation, having such a form of government. And hey, maybe you're okay with that, but we need to honestly say that the Pledge of Allegiance is in fact a pledge to your government. But if you're not okay with it, and likely for the reason you would make the defense that it isn't a pledge to the government in the first place, well, we need to be honest about that too. If pledging allegiance to any other government rubs you the wrong way, do we admit that it's the same, or do we go on without because our republic is the best government that we can imagine or that we've ever seen, so we should pledge allegiance to it lest it fall into some sort of socialism or something like that? The pledge is also a promise to an object, the flag. It's in the first line. I pledge allegiance to the flag. And then again, when we say, and to the republic for which it stands, it being the flag. Now, I am trying very hard to not insert my own opinions of what pledging your allegiance to an inanimate object can also be called. Instead, let's just look at some definitions of the words in the pledge. As I said, a pledge is a promise. And what are you promising to the flag and the government for which it stands? Your allegiance. What is allegiance? Back to our Merriam-Webster's dictionary, which defines allegiance as the obligation of a feudal vassal to his liege lord, the fidelity owed by a subject or citizen to a sovereign or government, the obligation of an alien to the government under which the alien resides, devotion or loyalty to a person, group, or cause. Okay, I don't think we're going to have any disputes there. But I would like to simmer on the language and what it means. Instead of the words we memorize from childhood, try inserting any of the other synonyms. I promise my loyalty, my devotion. I am obligated to the flag and the government for which it stands. And one more thing to throw in the pot as we think about our loyalty to an object of government. I pledge my allegiance, my loyalty, and devotion to the flag itself, and the government for which it stands. Let's look at the code book from the government for which the flag stands and see how the government describes the flag that stands for it. In the U.S. Code of Law, Title 4, Chapter 1, is where we find the Pledge of Allegiance and the flag codified. Section 4 has the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag and its instructions for delivery. Section 8 is interesting, though, as it lists all manner of how you must show respect to the flag. It says in line J, the flag represents a living country and is itself considered a living thing. That is interesting. An inanimate object endowed with a position of reverence due to it being a living thing. We've grown up with the flag just as much as the pledge that we make to it. So it's no wonder we don't think twice about it. And granted, we don't go around stating that it is a living thing. But this is the foundational doctrine of the flag. This is why the government for which the flag stands, both of the things we are pledging our loyalty and allegiance to, say are the reasons why we owe it so much respect and allegiance, because it is a living thing. Similar to how we imagined the binding of the pledge in the Bible, what would you think if it were a statue that we pledged to instead of a flag? What would that look like? I pledge allegiance to Mount Rushmore. Or I pledge allegiance to a smaller statue of an eagle or some other common symbol of the United States. What if we said this statue or other symbol were the living embodiment of the nation that we are pledging to? How would that look? How would that make you feel if it were some other material other than cloth? Maybe stone, wood, or gold. Just try that out in the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the statue of the United States of America and the republic for which it stands. All right, I don't want to belabor the point on all that, but I do want to say one more thing that the pledge is. It's also the acceptance that the nation is indivisible. This is interesting because there are a few things that come to mind when you think of the nation as divisible. 1, the Civil War, and 2, secession. The Civil War is something most people today affirm as sad or that we wish it wouldn't have happened. I do think it's interesting and ironic that people fly the Confederate flag alongside the United States flag, but besides that, most people look at the Civil War as necessary to keep the Union together. Seems strange further still as we look at secession. It's a popular ideal for freedom-loving Americans, but it is interesting how the rhetoric never comes full circle. Secession seems to be this agreed-upon method of preserving freedom, yet any enthusiastic support kind of fizzles out when we are confronted with the divisible Union. I wonder why that is, and I wonder if it has anything to do with this grateful rhetoric of saving the Union, or the memorization of a line proclaiming that under God our nation is indivisible. All right, we already said where the pledge did not come from, so let's discuss where it did come from. And if I may, prepare yourself. This may be the most shocking part of this. Although there was a pledge written during the Civil War by Captain George Thatcher Balch, the pledge that we say today is primarily the work of Francis Bellamy in 1892, and then later adopted as the pledge by Congress in 1942. So, just so we are keeping our dates straight, that means it was written over 100 years after the American Revolution and officially recognized by the government over 150 years after the American Revolution. One more, the Under God part was added in 1954, almost 10 years after its initial adoption. So let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. Who is Francis Bellamy? Francis Bellamy was born on May 18, 1855, in Mount Morris, New York, and died on August 28, 1931, in Tampa, Florida. He studied theology at the University of Rochester in Rochester, New York, and became a Baptist minister like his father. In 1889, Bellamy co-founded the Society of Christian Socialists with Episcopal priest William Dwight Porter Bliss in Boston. This society and the quickly produced monthly magazine titled The Dawn espoused socialism from an explicitly Christian viewpoint. The Mises website has a free copy of The Forging of American Socialism by Howard Quint, if you'd like more information on all of that. And like always, I'll have a link in the show notes. In 1891, according to the book Freethinkers by Susan Jacoby, Bellamy was forced from his Boston pulpit for preaching against the evils of capitalism. Also in 1891, Bellamy was hired by Daniel Ford to work in the premium department for the children's magazine Youth's Companion. 3 years earlier, in 1888, the magazine began a campaign called the Schoolhouse Flag Movement, or a Flag Over Every Schoolhouse movement. It was intended to build subscriptions by selling U.S. flags to public schools. According to the National Museum of American History, the magazine became involved with Americanization efforts, in part because of the personal interest of the magazine's leadership, but also because of the publisher's desire to boost subscription sales through gimmicks and giveaways that appealed to the patriotic fervor of the times. These gimmicks included campaigns to distribute American flags to every school and the promotion of inexpensive images of George Washington to supplement other portraits gracing classroom walls. Both of the magazine's efforts were successful in boosting magazine sales and, in the process, fostering a tradition of patriotic material culture in American classrooms. The museum also says in 1892, as part of the 400th anniversary of Columbus's birth and the National Public School celebration, the magazine published Bellamy's Pledge of Allegiance. It read, "I pledge allegiance to my flag and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all." Along with the words of the pledge, Bellamy came up with a salute as well. It is called the Bellamy Salute if you'd like to look at some of these schoolhouse photos from that era. But if you haven't seen it, I'll save you the time and let you know that the salute is exactly what would become later known as the Nazi salute, which is why it was changed to being a hand over your heart during World War II. Which begs two large questions. Would diehard conservative traditionalist patriots object to someone using the originally intended salute? If not, why? And two, does it mean anything that the salutes were the same? Was the Nazi salute no big deal? Does it only matter that Nazis did it, or did they do it because that sort of pledging and saluting goes to some nationalistic heart of this matter? Did we change the salute simply because of the optics of being associated with the Nazis? Or are we also trying to hide similar motivations behind a nationalistic socialist movement in America and the National Socialist Party of Germany during the same time? In 1954, Congress added "under God" and therefore set the 31-word pledge that we still use today. I think we need to ask more questions about the pledge, even if we are just asking ourselves in self-reflection. I've asked a lot about what we think, all of you probably being adults, but as I think on all this coming from a school campaign targeted at kids, and as I started reflecting on all of this, that we are all introduced to this as kids, do you think it's right to have kids memorize these words, making a promise to a flag and government for which it stands, when they do not even know what these words mean?
And it's really not creepy to have little kids mindlessly recite this anthem every day and pledge their life to a government before they're old enough to really think about what they're saying. This is not a form of brainwashing. This is not a form of brainwashing. This is not a form of brainwashing.
Maybe you like the pledge. Should we reserve it just for adults that have thoroughly scrutinized the words? Bellamy isn't alive today, But he did leave behind some thoughts on the matter, and I think I'll start closing all this out with some of his words on the pledge. In the book, The History of the Pledge of Allegiance, Bellamy's thoughts on the pledge are quoted as this: "It began as an intensive communing with salient points of our national history, from the Declaration of Independence onwards, with the makings of the Constitution, with the meaning of the Civil War, with the aspiration of the people. The true reason for allegiance to the flag is the republic for which it stands. And what does that last thing, the republic, mean? It is the concise political word for the nation, the one nation which the Civil War was fought to prove. To make that one nation idea clear, we must specify that it is indivisible, as Webster and Lincoln used to repeat in their great speeches. Just here arose the temptation of the historic slogan of the French Revolution, which meant so much to Jefferson and his friends: liberty, equality, fraternity. No, that would be too fanciful, too many thousands of years off in realization. But we as a nation do stand square on the doctrine of liberty and justice for all." The authors also stated in this book, Bellamy viewed his pledge as an inoculation that would protect immigrants and native-born but insufficiently patriotic Americans from the virus of radicalism and subversion. So there it is. That is my sum up of the 3 points I think we need to consider with the Pledge of Allegiance: what it isn't, what it is, and where it came from. Did you learn anything new? Are you considering any of these questions for the first time? Are there any answers to these questions that are troubling? Does it kind of take that red-blooded patriotic American spirit out of the pledge when you find out that it's the work of a socialist that was just using it to sell magazine subscriptions? Am I against the outstretched 45-degree armed salute just because Nazis did it, or is there a deeper objection? If there is a deeper objection, what's to say that a pledge in English with a hand over our heart is somehow immune to whatever psychological propagandizing we might see in saying a pledge in German with an outstretched salute? Do the same actions, but in context of different state governments, change anything? Again, I keep asking these questions because something this ingrained in our identity, presented so early, memorized so early in our lives, needs to be questioned, rather than me telling you what I think that you should think. And isn't that kind of the point to all this anyways? Questioning something we are told to think? Were you brought up to pledge your allegiance before you knew what you were pledging? And who you were pledging to? And in today's environment, if you even question it, are you not accused of being insufficiently patriotic?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Don't forget to subscribe to the Anarcho-Christian Podcast on whatever podcast you're using. If you're not sure where to find us, visit anarchochristian.com/subscribe. There you'll find links to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Android, Google Play, and YouTube. If you're enjoying the podcast, please consider letting us know by leaving a 5-star rating and review on iTunes. Also, like and share the episode on Facebook or the other social media sites. You can support the show with a monthly donation through Patreon. And as a thank you, I'd like to read off the names of the people that are making this possible: Al, Shayon, Craig, Devin, Jesse, Jonathan, Joseph, JR, Leonard, Mark, Matt, Nathaniel, Patrick, Paul, Scott, the Mortuary Podcast, Tom, and Tom. I really appreciate it, y'all. And if anyone else is interested, visit the support tab on anarchochristian.com. That'll take you to our Patreon page where you'll find a few ways that you can support us. So I think that's it for today. Grace and peace. No king but Christ.
He cried out to God, won't you help them to believe? This power is illusion, the need to rule is greed. Your love and your light is really all they need. It's
Thank you for listening to the Anarcho-Christian Podcast. Subscribe to our email notifications at anarchochristian.com, like us on facebook.com/anarchochristian, and follow us on Twitter at anarchoxp. Subscribe to our podcast and YouTube to join us next time as we continue to evaluate the relationship between the Christian and the state. No king but Christ.
This has been a Pax Libertas Productions podcast.
God said there's a secret